And we're live. Well, welcome to the 10th episode of Scuttlebutt with Phill, where we will be discussing From the Earth to the Stars. But for a moment there, I'll take a moment to thank you, ladies, gentlemen, extraterrestrials, hobbits, cryptids, to another episode of the show. We'll be exploring my longtime passion project, From the Earth to the Stars. I hope you enjoy it. It's going to be quite a ride. So we'll have a little PowerPoint slide ready here. It's a little rough, but I think it works for what we're trying to achieve for today. And we'll try to keep ourselves to a little bit under 2 hours. I think we probably won't last more than an hour, but we'll see how fast we can get through all of these slides. But I think you'll enjoy what you see. So if you give me 1 second, we'll go ahead and do that. For whatever reason, these slides weren't agreeing with me too much. But anyway, as we begin our episode, we move on to the first item of the day, which will be our little slideshow. Sorry about that. There is no easy way from the Earth to the stars. Seneca the Younger. So I brought in this the official trailer to The Martian, which we could play live, but for whatever reason we were having issues with it. But picture yourself, or in this case the character Frank Sawyer, stranded on an alien planet with a companion robot he's named Johnny. And the robot is not capable of doing anything but kind of placating him and making him feel like he's talking to basically just like a corporate answering machine. And so he's going crazy. And little by little, over the course of several months, he gradually starts losing resources, running out of food, running out of basic necessities, and things are becoming quite dire. And he's struggling to make sense of it. And ultimately, he decides that he's going to try to make for a rock formation nearby, which he thinks reminds him of Lake Powell in Arizona. And ultimately, he chooses to basically die there because his oxygen has run out, and his companion robot basically says that he would call for help, but the help would arrive basically well after he's expired. So it's like the robot doesn't see any use in trying to call for assistance. But Frank basically blacks out due to the lack of oxygen, but he's rescued just in time by one of his best friends, which we will explore in another segment as well as another novel. But the short story basically was something I shared to the MFA program, and it's received a lot of praise. But beyond that, he's reawakened or reborn on a space station. And these two technicians are trying to investigate him. And they find out that he's not actually dead, but barely clinging on to life. And so instead of having his body discarded for waste, they end up bringing him out of there and reviving him. And I think a few weeks pass, and an emissary from the company tries to convince him that, I guess, just trying to save face for the company because the company basically made it seem like they don't care about him, which is probably true. Although I've never portrayed the company in the story, Vega Aerospace, as a malevolent corporation, but more of like an ambivalent corporation, which I don't think is any better, but is certainly not something that I think would be unrealistic for that situation. But beyond that, he asks the emissary in response to his query about what can he do for him in this moment. And really, it's mostly either to save face for the company, but also to kind of throw a dog a bone. Because I don't even think the company thought he was going to survive, but he did. So Frank says, "I want that." He's pointing at the the newly constructed warp ship that they have, the Ambitious, which will be his ship that he takes on his adventures through the remainder of the books. So we will see how that adventure goes. But that is just the short story that preludes everything else in the story. I wanted to kind of use The Martian to illustrate this point because The Martian, I think, captures the essence of this struggle for survival in this tale of resilience. And I think it's really well drawn there, especially in the movie, but also in the book. And it's one of my favorites. I also like the character of Mark Watney. Mark Watney is a inspiration for Frank Sawyer's persona somewhat. He's also based on elements of other sort of easygoing, laid-back characters that I've seen that have been heroes in different science fiction franchises, and some of that will become very obvious as time goes on. But beyond this, we move further on. So, From the Earth to the Stars, a 28 novel epic of space adventure created by Philip A. Leavenworth. And that's me. But first and foremost, who am I? Well, as I mentioned before, I'm Philip A. Leavenworth, originally from Los Angeles, specifically Paramount, near Long Beach, California. It's basically in between both of those nodes. I'm a former LA Times employee. I worked there for 6 years. And I now reside in San Diego while I attend San Diego State for my MFA in creative writing. Eventually, I'm planning to pursue a PhD in literature, probably something related to my love for science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Although most likely I'm thinking it'll be something more related to science fiction, but maybe a crossover between science fiction and horror. Because my dream is to be a college professor by day and a filmmaker / novelist at night. So all of this to facilitate that movement. And the story represents my lifelong passion project. And as you can see here in these above photos, I really like the YouTube channel Red Letter Media. And I've met the independent filmmaker and absolute genius, the Brainius, Neil Breen. And that was quite the experience when that did happen. But moving on. Introduction. So this novel series emerged out of a desire to create my own space adventure that I had grown up with. And some of these included Star Trek Enterprise, Star Trek Voyager, Battlestar Galactica, both the 1978 and 2003 versions of the show. Even the Star Wars prequels, aspects of them were very integral to the development of this piece, and especially the Mass Effect trilogy. I'd even throw Halo in there. It's not mentioned here in the slides, but Halo is also a big influence. The Stargate franchise, Stargate SG-1, and Stargate Atlantis are heavily inspired by, or my series is heavily inspired by those, and Space 1999. I grew up in a rather strange time in the sense that I grew up with a lot of the 1970s science fiction aesthetic that my dad had grown up with, and so I'm pretty partial to that era. And I grew up in the 2000s and the 90s, but more the 2000s and the 90s. Most of the series that I remember from the 90s, I watched after the fact in the 2000s from marathons that they played constantly on Sci-Fi Channel. So that was my sort of introduction to that stuff at that point in time. But I've been writing some iteration of From the Earth to the Stars since I was about 9 years old, and this is going to get us into some other deeper conversations, which is um, the earliest elements of this story date back to September 2001. And yes, the very same 2001 that we experienced some pretty terrible events. Um, but basically, this means that this universe has been in constant development for over 23 years. The first iteration of the story focused on the crew of the world's first warp ship, which is basically, bluntly, a reference to Enterprise. But Enterprise has the unfortunate um, the unfortunate possibility of having to resuscitate everything in the Star Trek franchise, and so the problem with that is that it's bogged down by a lot of the Star Trek baggage. Whereas my show would not be. My series would be its own entity, and it would go through its own story. But over the years, the story has altered into other sort of avenues where we focused on an alien civilization, an action heroine protagonist, partly thanks to Mass Effect, and then back to the first iteration where we focused on the crew of the first warp ship. So I wanted something grounded, and I wanted something that was mostly hard science fiction, but also at first something of a drama. But I didn't want anything that was too cheesy. I mean, there's going to be elements of this that are going to be a little bit more hokey and kind of kitsch, but I think they work for the aesthetic ends that I want to achieve. So we'll see if any of you guys agree with me on that one or not. But overall, that's how this thing came about to begin with. But the general premise. The general premise is that Frank Sawyer, the protagonist, is assigned to command humanity's first warp ship, the Ambitious. The warp drive is referred to as the Gautier drive, and in the series, it's named after a French-Canadian astrophysicist named Jean-Michel Gautier, which is also the name of a very, very big science communicator named John Michael Gautier, who has been pretty influential on these stories, as well as science and futurism with Isaac Arthur, but I don't have any characters based on him necessarily, at least not yet. But anyway, Frank Sawyer is a third generation astronaut, so his grandfather and father were also astronauts, but his grandfather was the second man to walk on the moon, and while his father was one of the first humans to visit Saturn and one of its moons, this one of them, namely the largest moon, Titan. But as the novels go on, and especially on their first few missions, they discover that the possibility of intelligent life is exceedingly rare, while life that is simple is pretty abundant. So simple life, your viruses, your bacterias, your fungus, all of that is pretty prolific through the universe. But in this universe, intelligent spacefaring life is exceedingly rare. And we're kind of playing off the idea that intelligent life is prone to self destruction in more ways than one. And oftentimes, the civilization that tries to do too much ends up burning out quickly. And so we run across a lot of those. And it's essentially, if you think of Star Trek as a series where they only run across is dead planets with civilizations that have been dead for centuries. Something about it just kind of clicked for me, and I think that this would be an interesting perspective to explore in the science fiction genre. But despite this, vested interests attempt to use this new FTL method to acquire new resources across the galaxy. So this is where we get into the influence of energy companies to do their best to make money off of space travel in ways that dwarf how we're able to accomplish that in our timeline. But the basic idea for the entire series, the central gimmick, has always been, what if Star Trek was possible today? And so we will explore how that manifests itself through this 28 novel series. So this is the Fermi paradox solution. So as we mentioned earlier, simple life is abundant in the universe, but intelligent spacefaring life is exceedingly rare. And so this idea was kind of born out of a contrary idea of this concept that in like most science fiction, you'll see aliens that are essentially like us, but maybe slightly different. And oftentimes what you'll find is that these aliens tend to basically be human in all but name, and only certain elements are sort of kept. And I think that's partly a very anthropocentric view. I think that's a little bit more interesting when you explore the contrary ideas. But as you can see here in the little sort of artistic drawing, you have the planet of the creatures and the main creatures that you can find, as well as a depiction of the landscape. I really kind of like that look. You might replicate it somewhere else down the line. So our characters, and this is a concept drawing of the interior of the XCV-330 Enterprise, which is the ring Enterprise from Star Trek the Motion Picture, as well as a few other things around the franchise. But the crew of the Ambitious is made up of 6 astronauts. 2 robotic assistants accompany the crew, and as the series goes on, some of the characters will be replaced or even die on their journey. No one's fate is fixed, necessarily. So I'm a big believer in trying not to chicken out, and that if you're going to kill a character, you better dedicate yourself to the decision and not cop out. So, yeah, there will be at least 1 or 2 characters that don't make it out of the sort of missions that they're on. So, who that is and who it could be, we might have to save for later. But yes, I'll go ahead and introduce you to the crew of 6. So we have a bunch of little concept photos, which are initially I designed some from AI, but then I decided to not present those, and I opted to instead show photos of actors that I can see portraying these characters, and sort of some of the characters are people that have photos that I write the characters thinking of. Like, I'm thinking of these characters as I'm writing these actors as these characters while I'm writing. So I think it's a little bit easier in the process. But as I mentioned earlier, Frank Sawyer is the main character of at least 7 of the 28 books. As mentioned earlier, he's an American 3rd-generation astronaut, Vega Aerospace commercial astronaut, in fact, and he's his mid-30s at the start of the series. And he's always dreamed of owning his very own spaceship from a young age. The focus of the prologue short story, where he struggled to survive, was designed to show his resilience in the face of hardship, which will be parallel with the story that we'll be encountering as we move along in the series' time. But yes, characters. Frank Sawyer has a strained relationship with his father, and the idea here is to not portray a family that is disadvantaged by having a dad in the relationship, but more or less how a child has to grapple with the father being absent for like work or something. And that's kind of something I've been working my way through. I mean, I don't blame him for anything, but the relationship between my own father and Frank's is not really based on anything that my father and I have done. There's more elements that I borrowed from my relationship with my mother instead. And the thought has been made to me that I should probably do everything I can to ensure that we try to develop that relationship in a manner that is sort of role model status for how a man should conduct himself as a parent, as a father. So I don't think that's touched on too greatly in science fiction. I think I'll be one of the first, if not the first, to cover it, but we shall see. So beyond this, we have his second in command, mission pilot Alana Olson. She's an Australian astronaut as well as a Vega Aerospace commercial astronaut, former Royal Australian Air Force pilot in her mid-30s, and she shares a similar dream as Frank, but she wants to own her own command one day. Or she wants her own command one day. She grew up in a family mostly men and felt the need to prove herself in that environment. And this is a person that's kind of based on people I've known in my own life, and her elements have been borrowed from Space 1999's character Alan Carter, and so that's where the name Alana comes from. But I think it's an interesting way we could approach this situation, so that's what we've ended up with. Flight engineer Quinn Mosley. He's an American propulsion engineer on loan from the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. He's portrayed as a person in his late 20s. He's supposed to be the youngest member of the crew. He's also the resident science fiction expert and has an encyclopedic knowledge of the literature, film, and television aspects of the genre. As opposed to the commander's dreams, Quinn is mostly a person who dreams of exploring space for eternity. And also, he's something of a pyromaniac, so that'll be interesting to explore as well. We have another character, science specialist Sebastian Eccles. And he's a British omnidisciplinary scientist, as well as a former child prodigy. But he's spent his entire adult life doing his best to destroy this image in the minds of people. He's also in his mid-50s, specializes in knowledge of astrophysics and astrobiology. His biggest hobby is horticulture. So he's basically the resident weed dealer on the ship, and I think that's something that we don't touch on that much in science fiction. Kind of wondering why that would be. But his biggest dream is to be the first human to communicate with an intelligent extraterrestrial. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that works out. So, to our next character, journalist Lee Collins. She's a Canadian photojournalist and reporter. She's on loan from the New York Tribune newspaper. And she's portrayed as being in her late 40s, early 50s. She's a world-weary person due to her time in war zones like South Africa and the Saudi Arabian kingdom. And she dreams of being the first human to capture the essence of the crew during their space flight and humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial life. And our last member of the main crew, robotic specialist Sasheen Bates. She's an indigenous American robotics expert in charge of the maintenance of the scout robots and robot assistants. She is portrayed as being in her mid to late 20s and a representative from the Navajo Nation. She's an active duty officer in the United States Space Command, so her position differs. but her dream is about finding a home among the stars. The two non-human characters that are on the crew are the robots Jack and Jill. And there's kind of a running gag that I have set up where each of the robots are kind of named after, well, they all share the initial J. So all the characters are some variation of a J name, and this is mostly because we've kind of established that the names of the robots uh, here are Jack and Jill, so we're referencing an old nursery rhyme, and then we have kind of the difference between the two. As you can see here, the next generation robot, the Jester 9 series of robotic assistants, are pictured at the right. So I kind of favor this blonde cap look to the aliens, or to the robots, excuse me. The older model that Frank encountered on the planet as his sort of assistant uh, resembled the Honda Asimo robot, and somewhere in between the two, there's some sort of connective tissue. But beyond that, yeah, these are the two robots that joined them on the mission, and they resemble the being on the right, not the being on the left. Just so you know. So other characters that we have include Commander Martin Sawyer, a veteran American astronaut, retired U.S. Marine Corps colonel, former astronaut with the NASA JPL program and Vega Aerospace. He's portrayed as being in his late 60s, early 70s, and then it's suggested that he served on the first crewed mission to the planet Saturn and its moon Titan, and that will be featured in at least one or two short stories that I have cooking up. But beyond this two, he has an estranged relationship with his sons, Frank and Ben. We haven't met Ben yet, so we won't go over his character just yet. But I think his major problem is that he could never learn to basically become a dad and be that father, since he was always out on space missions. And so he has inadvertently fallen into the trap of basically being like his dad. So this has been a generational mistake, and we'll be exploring a little bit of that too as the series goes. Governor James Devlin, he's an American colonial governor, former Vega Aerospace executive, and his loyalties lie in some surprising areas. He desires to make a homeworld for people like him, and he holds a specific set of values that he thinks are on the way to extinction in the modern era. He's going to be the villain for the first few novels, and then there are some others planned for the remainder. He seeks an alliance with Frank at first, but he also dreams of being the next Alexander the Great on a new planet. So there's a little bit of ego going on with this character. But beyond that, that about closes it out for at least a little bit for our characters. After this, we move on to factions of the series. So the series has quite a few factions involved. We'll be going on a tour of the main factions of the galaxy next. So I hope you look forward to that. So the United States government plays a major role in these series, as it does in pretty much all my writing for some reason. But the United States government has only access to 48 states in this timeline. Alaska and Hawaii never became states. The current U.S. president, as of 2024, is a man named Luke Nichols. And Luke Nichols is the main character of another novel that I wrote. And I'm kind of going back and forth on whether or not we're going to keep this element. The element that he's from, Luke Nichols, is from a novel called The American Dictator. And I haven't decided how we wanted to merge those ideas together, but We shall see. So by 2024, 2025, the U.S. has largely transitioned to a full fusion-based economy, and this has led several reactionary forces that are made up of pro-fossil fuel advocates called the Energy Independence Coalition, and they are actually quite the villainous group that we run into. And then we have Vega Aerospace. So in real life, this is a entertainment company founded by myself, and we're related to sort of the space efforts that we've seen in real life with SpaceX and Blue Origin. But in this timeline, in our timeline, Vega Aerospace is an entertainment company. In the novels, Vega Aerospace is very much a ambivalent corporation that tries to make money, and generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. However, there is everything wrong with treating your employees like dirt. So keep that in mind. But yes, Vega Aerospace was founded by tech billionaire Alexander Monroe. It's a successor corporation to William Winslow's space company, and William Winslow will come up later, but he's also a foundational character for this franchise, and without him, many things wouldn't happen. So it's kind of playing on the myth of the great man, but we're going to try to spin something on it that's a little more unique and interesting. But yeah, generally speaking, this company in this timeline became involved in space flight as early as the late 1970s. The main spacecraft for the interstellar expeditions are called scientific exploration vehicles, or SEVs. Their launches typically are from a decommissioned oil rig in the South Pacific called Launcher Pacifica, but they have other launches that are sent out here in Vandenberg Space Command Arsenal. So keep that one in mind too. It's a very interesting concept. The next group that we meet, so this series isn't completely devoid of references to intelligent life, especially if that life is very fleeting. But beyond this, the Kassan Arcanate are the major force that kind of drives the remainder of the series. They are independently evolved humans, so they don't share DNA with human beings, but there's a commonality to them, which is in the shape and size of who they are. But they are native to a trinary star system nicknamed the Home Star System. Their home world is called Kroos, and it is the fourth planet of that primary star system. The planet is colder and smaller than Earth, and it's also a stratocratic technocracy, which basically means it's a government run by military bureaucrats. And so there's a lot of humor that can be derived from the situation, which, I mean, I think it's good. It works for me. The planet is colder and smaller than the Earth, as I mentioned, which kind of leads to sort of a general look that I'd love to play off of with artists like Simon Stollenhag, who do really good work with kind of rendering these like big, gigantic things juxtaposed against smaller things. And I would love to see how an artist like him would do a coffee tale book for that specific novel, that specific story. But beyond that, it is ruled by a character called the Archon Prime. And the Archon Prime is sort of a emperor on steroids in certain ways, but he is kind of reined in by other structures within the society. And some of those structures include the Marshalsea, which is primarily made up of the military leadership as a whole, and they act as a checks and balances apparatus against certain elements. But still, we have the Assembly, the legislative branch, the Council, which is like an executive legislative branch, and then you have the services branch, which is basically in charge of letting people have fun But yeah, there's sort of that idea. But then you have the council, which is not a legislative organization, but they're more of a sort of executive branch. And as I mentioned earlier, the services branch is mostly in charge of civil service and how you contribute to the greater whole. While the consortium is the state owned corporation that pretty much undertakes all of the space travel efforts. And they're a direct analogy to um, sort of the bureaucratic elements that we've seen in some fiction before, especially in the works of Dune with the CHOAM and the Spacing Guild. And so that's kind of what the consortium is. But unlike the residents of Earth, the Kassan Arcanate lacks FTL technology, and they use chemical rockets to access a wormhole network that is discovered later down the line. But I don't know. I think it works out perfectly fine. But the Kassan Arcanate on the planet Kroos would probably look something like this aesthetically. The aesthetic resembles the 1950s America with business suits and cookie cutter residences, so everybody lives in the same kind of house, and there's very little deviation or very little creativity on the part of the citizenry. And it's going to be interesting to see how we render all that. But there's a lot of retro-futuristic elements that pervade everything. We have jetpacks, stainless steel rocket ships, robotic servants. We also have laser guns, which will look something like a pulp era firearm. But as you see here as well, the cities are packed with densely packed monolithic brutalistic buildings. And yeah, I don't know if any of that will be rendered properly, but we'll see as soon as we can find ourselves some really good visual artists. I would love to make some decisions. But beyond this, the Kassan people are not religious, and the Archon is basically their god. But they're a spiritual people, and they don't really buy into charlatanism that we usually fall into here on Earth at this moment. But for these people, the stars hold a lot of meaning, or the cosmos in general. So you can kind of think of that. And yes, we're still on factions of the series. Okay. So after this, we move on to the next topic, or the next faction, the Space Defense League, and they are the main sort of villains of the series. So, I mean, at least of the first few episodes. They are born out of a result of increased wealth and prosperity from the space travel that was brought to the first world nations, while leaving the third world nations as backwaters, as poverty-stricken and endless raids wage. So it's not the most ideal situation for many. But the SDL is a reaction against this paradigm. They have carried out terrorist attacks on the Earth, orbital stations, and on the moon in the past. So after that, we get to our next group, the Undertakers. Now, these are the only overtly alien-looking things that we run into in the entire series. The Undertakers are unknown entities with the ability to create illusions and offer suggestions. They appear to be robotic caretakers to the inert galaxy. We know that they are remnants of an ancient spacefaring civilization that left objects like the obelisks and other strange things behind. We kind of learned later on that the beings that are related to these folks are actually kind of we found out that these aliens were very into their art, and that was an entire civilization of artists. And the reason they went extinct was due to the fact that they had run out of things to create. And it's not exactly clear in the story whether or not this was due to any environmental cause or just certain technological advances just left them pretty uh, pretty susceptible to um, self disintegration. And it's a shame, but they the Undertakers are capable of cataloging and referencing any alien race that has gone extinct for one reason or another, and so that's what one of their uses is. But one of the characters we will often see is called the Visitor, and he kind of looks like this pictured. This is a screenshot from an episode of The Outer Limits where this being is portrayed as like the smartest being there could be, and so I find that interesting. But yeah, as you will see, or as you've seen, it is the Visitor is pictured here, and the creature, or rather the entity that he represents, is a recurring character through the series. So beyond this, we have our next major section, which is alternate history, which basically means a different path. So the timeline diverges from our own in the late 1910s at the start of World War II. So it's a little bit interesting how I tried to approach this. I mean, one of the marketing things that I've been discussing with some is to kind of run it as if you're a fan of For All Mankind or one of the recent Battlestar Galacticas or any of this, to kind of just highlight the drama aspect that I want to maintain from this series. So I think we're going to do our best to try and do that. But time will tell. So without further ado, we'll be walking back in time and going over the changes to the timeline in general. So here we go. So the 1910s are the point of divergence. The specific point of divergence is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are added to the demands for the Treaty of Versailles. And this ultimately leads to Germany being treated less harshly by the other major European powers. And the Central Powers basically still losing territory and paying reparations, but still nothing close to the amounts that they were paying in our timeline. So there's still a little bit of discontent with the West and how we've treated them. So we'll see how that shakes out. I'm planning to do a short story collection where we kind of have one short story set in each decade, and yeah, to see other people doing it would be interesting. But anyway, beyond that, the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s, resembles the 1920s that we have in our reality, at least aesthetically. But the difference is that Leon Trotsky takes over from Vladimir Lenin in 1924, and then Woodrow Wilson's nephew, William Gibbs McAdoo, assumes the presidency in 1920, where he serves a term and basically refuses to run again in 1924, and basically just serves out his remaining term without having to deal with the major elements of the scandal. But the Great Depression still happens like it did in our timeline, although it is somewhat less severe. But less severe could mean many things. And then the turbulent 30s. So the 1930s are an era where Leon Trotsky decides to fulfill his lifelong dream of creating a world communism where it's just like perpetual revolution all over the world. And this kind of mentality leads him to becoming this timeline's sort of, expansionist, uh, Hitler-esque boogeyman. And then uh, Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected, as he was in our timeline in 1932 and 1936, like our timeline. And the 1930s is very similar to our timeline in that the world is still recovering from the Great Depression. And the Nazis do not come to power here. Instead, Otto Dickel and his Volkisch movement emerges and subsumes anything else in the specific movements that were out there. So, just as Hitler had, Trotsky in this timeline opts to invade Poland. And thus begins World War II. So, the fraught 40s, 1940s. Unlike the decades that preceded it, the development of the atomic bomb at the Project Manhattan site was integral to changing the world for the better. Because ultimately, without the discovery of nuclear weapons, there is no discovery for anything else. World War II still occurs as it had in our timeline, but the US, UK, and Germany are all allies. And the Soviets are the scourge of Europe, while the Japanese are the scourge of the Pacific. But both, in fact, are not allied. In fact, Russia and Japan are in open conflict with each other. The Soviet Russia is attacked 5 times with atomic bombs, and Trotsky is killed. So, at the same time, concurrently, the mainland Japan is invaded by Operation Downfall, which is going to be the largest amphibious assault in world history, as well as undertaken by the United States. So, but yes, beyond this, the thing about Operation Downfall was that the invasion force was going to cost about 1 million lives, and so it kind of does in this timeline too. But World War II ends in November of 1945 instead of in August 1945. The U.S. and Germany emerge as the 2 most powerful nations on Earth, and the Cold War begins. But unlike our timeline, in 1949, the U.S. and Germany initiate the space race. In the United States, Henry Wallace assumes the presidency after FDR passes away in 1945, and Henry Wallace is not anti-war, but he's definitely he's anti-totalitarian, anti-authoritarian, so he does not support the Trotsky-esque or the Trotskyist Russians, and only serves a single term. And then in 1948, he runs for re-election with Thomas Dewey running as his opposition, and Thomas Dewey becomes president in November 1948, which gives us 1949 situation where he is president, and he decides that instead of our timeline where Eisenhower had picked had chosen NASA as a civilian agency to head up the space effort, as opposed to the United States military doing it. Whereas Dewey opts to do the very opposite. So the United States military ends up picking it up instead of the civilian agencies. So NASA doesn't emerge just yet, but the United States military is reorganized into a different series of organizations. So you end up having the Department of Defense being developed out of this, the CIA, actually not the CIA, the NIA, so it's the National Intelligence Agency, which is a CIA analog in this timeline. And then you have the United States Air Force that emerges from the United States Army. So those things are the same, except instead of happening in 1947, they happened in 1949. So that's the one difference. Thomas Dewey serves for 2 terms, and it leads us into the presidency of Richard Nixon. So from 1949 to 1957, Thomas Dewey is the president of the United States, and Earl Warren is the vice president of the United States, which delays several Supreme Court decisions and affects the timeline quite drastically, at least in terms of the Supreme Court decisions. So we'll call this one the freeing 50s. So the Germans beat America at nearly every turn, and the Germans placed their first astronaut in orbit in 1959. So Americans don't do the same until about a month later. Werner von Braun leads the German space effort, while a fictional character. Michael Osgood leads the American effort. And Michael Osgood is kind of a mix between several different, excuse me, several different rocket engineers here in the United States, including someone named Philip Bono. And I think his designs are very interesting and forward-thinking. Yes, the U.S. space exploration effort is led by the United States Air Force in this timeline, not NASA. But NASA does come to existence in the mid to late 50s, but it is primarily a civilian exploratory agency concerned with space probes. So it kind of takes on a dual role with NASA JPL. So I think that's going to be the interesting change from our timeline to this one. But yeah, Nixon serves for a single term and is voted out in 1960, which gives us the swinging 60s. So with Nixon being thrown out, Nixon basically serves his term as president and doesn't return to politics. Instead, he gets involved in late night talk shows, and he becomes a rival to Johnny Carson. And essentially, he becomes the person that Americans come to kind of get their kind of feed on the world, since he was a former president. And they start calling Richard Nixon the most trusted man in America in this timeline. But aside from that, the Germans placed the first humans on the moon in 1967, which causes the United States to do the same about a month later. But this time it is the first man to walk on the moon, Frank Boone, a black American, and Wally Sawyer, the second man to walk on the moon, a white American. And they become the first Americans to set foot on the moon. So America wins by doing our bit for the cause of diversity. Due to this, more money, because the space race is now one of the most vital things to American society. More money is funneled into both the United States Air Force and the NASA space effort. So this is to keep the space exploration infrastructure going for years to come after this, as the United States is now competing directly with the Germans at nearly every turn. So from this point, we have JFK becomes president still. This is kind of the sore point that I'm still sort of developing, but either he is assassinated still in 1963, but by a different person, or he isn't and he serves 2 terms and gets us to the 1960s, or rather the 1970s. But I think the way it's written as it is now, JFK does get assassinated, but he gets assassinated someplace else and by someone else. And that leads to a 10-year presidency by Lyndon B. Johnson. And so From 1963 to 1973, Lyndon Baines Johnson is the president of the United States. And the second longest duration of a person serving as president. So he's able to do much more, thankfully, because he doesn't have to deal with Vietnam, because the Vietnam War doesn't happen quite like it did in our timeline or at all. And so he's able to do much, much different things with that. So after that, we're now in the 70s, the shifting 70s. So the first American moon base is established in the early 1970s, while the Germans kind of lag behind a little bit on that one. A crewed Venus flyby is committed in the mid 1970s, and that's by the United States as part of their applications program for the Pilgrim project. So the people who land on the moon are part of Project Pilgrim in this timeline, not Project Apollo. And Project Pilgrim is a space program that kind of takes what we learned at Gemini and expands it, and basically uses the same frame for multitudes of different types of spacecraft. And I think it's very interesting to see how that'll develop in this series. Werner von Braun dies as he did in our timeline in 1977. But unlike in our timeline, his death, due to him being the primary German rocket engineer, the priorities shift from just making things about the efforts to go to Mars, but also going it alone. They find that trying to commit a mission to Mars is going to be extremely expensive, and it will have to require invention of new technology, similar to how they were doing during the moon missions. But now with the biggest driving force behind the program gone, and not a lot of autonomy given to a lot of the different rocket bureaus, Germany is at the bargaining table to discuss with the U.S. to discuss the possibility of a joint crewed mission to Mars. And so it's Ronald Reagan, who was president between 1973 and 1981, to make that decision. And ultimately, that is the decision they decide to go to as a way of splitting the difference and keeping the monetary funds from drying. So by 1981, there's a new president in the White House. This guy is Robert Walker. He only serves a single term. He's sort of the analogy to Jimmy Carter in this timeline. But from 85 to 93, there's a president named William Morgan. And William Morgan is a former astronaut and senator from Indiana who sort of leads his own Reagan revolution, but it's something else entirely. It's sort of a libertarian revolution in the Republican Party that kind of changes a lot of the dynamics of the situation, at least in the political realm. So afterwards, the joint crewed mission to Mars occurs in 1986 and lands in 1987. Other events that occur throughout the 80s is that there's greater developments of the Earth and the Moon system, and there's now the formation of the Space Settlement Society with their goal of building Allen cylinders. We call them O'Neill cylinders here, as well as power sats being developed and asteroid mining being discussed. So now we are in the nifty 90s. So the asteroid mining and power sat launches create an entire new branch of influential people. The world's first trillionaires in as little as 5 years. The asteroid, nicknamed Motherlode, is brought to the Earth-Moon L5 position. This single asteroid becomes the biggest rock that's been exploited by the different countries of the world to keep everyone from falling into some sort of a destitution. But Motherlode is a key game changer for the planet. But while this is all happening, an asteroid impact deflection mission is launched. It's a joint mission to stop an asteroid from impacting the Earth, and so it's kind of a nod to Armageddon and Deep Impact from my perspective, which I understand might be too different for some people to accept, but that's okay. I like the reference. But by 1999, an international space effort in the form of the International Space Treaty Organization is born. So ISTO becomes the leader of space operations throughout the world, as the world becomes more and more dedicated to cosmopolitan, universalist sort of dogma. Some would probably call it neoliberalism, but this would be a neoliberalism that actually works. So then we move from there to the austere aughts. So we've now made it to the 21st century, and more developments of the solar system and warp speed are being developed, produced. The private crewed mission to the planet Saturn occurs via slingshot of Jupiter. The mission launches in 2005 and arrives in 2007. They stay a year on the planet and then decide to return to Earth, in which case they return to Earth in 2010. So it turns out, by the end of all things, it turns out that mission was a 5-year mission. Martin Sawyer, Frank's dad, is the mission pilot on that mission, and he's also the first human to fly a glider through the atmosphere of Saturn and its moon Titan. So we get into the most recent decade, the new tens, where the conditions on Earth are greatly improving due to this shift away from fossil fuels and emergence of green politics. Heavy industry is beginning its transition off Earth, further development of the solar system, construction of the first warp-capable ship, the Ambitious, and then the first survey missions to other star systems using FTL occur. It is a great time to be alive. And we have the new 20s. So in this timeline, the Exxon Corporation and other former oil companies have largely transitioned to using fusion energy or are responsible for mining helium-3 and hydrocarbons from Saturn and Titan and on the moon. Vega Aerospace, for the most part, is the only game in town at this point in time, so you have to kind of play by the rules. And as this motto suggests, if you want to get to space, you go through Vega. The Ambitious crew is selected, trained, and launched by 2026, and that'll be when the story begins. And this gets us to our next slide, where we are now brought to the present day, 2024 to 2025. The setting of 2024 to 2025 is important, despite the fact that the first warp ship launches in 2026. There will be a series of novels that will occur before the first launch, which are set in a separate spot that take place in 2025. But the first contact with intelligent aliens is not planned until 2029. So each novel / eventually TV show / film will be taking place concurrently with the release date of the book. And so those movies and television shows will also be set during the book timeline, so that there is very little that needs to be changed in that regard. But beyond that, we also have ad time. So this will be our ad time for the real life Vega Aerospace. So we'll come back wide for a moment. So basically, Vega Aerospace in space. No one can hear you. So, all right, back to the show. So the plan is to first adapt the series into novels, and then later the series might become films, or at least 2 television shows and more. I mean, there's concepts for comic books, for all kinds of things, and ultimately it would be nice to get that done with ample time. So there's sort of a timeline being worked out, and there's other things going on at the moment that will definitely inform how I want to approach this. But generally speaking, there are 28 novels, and ideally we would. Sorry about that. Eventually, we would adapt the books into films or television, and I'm envisioning at least 2 television shows and at least 15 books, or 15 movies, and that's mostly based on the idea that um, movies would be basically big event films, while the TV shows would be more drawn out for world building and character development purposes. And I think the character driven aspect of a TV show is way better for that format. So we will be definitely diving further into that when the time comes. So this next section. So for those of you who don't like spoilers, I would recommend averting your eyes or just not tuning in from this point on. It's definitely not going to be for your benefit if you think that um, spoilers do anything for you or your health. So I would definitely hazard you to go away now. Don't watch further if you don't want to be spoiled. But if you want to continue, all I say is watch at your own risk. So this will be the deep dive into the rest of the series. So these slides are mostly incomplete. I wanted to do something more with them, but I don't have any imagery that really works outside of certain contexts. So the first trilogy is the Cross Chronicles, and this will be a trilogy of books focused on the life of the daughter of the Kassan Archanates, Archon Prime, and she's kind of an action heroine who tries to save the world, sort of thing, but not in the way you would expect. It's going to be done in a way that I don't think is done close to enough, and this will sort of set the stage for events later on, since there'll be 2 branches of the series that'll come together in a little bit, which would be the Cross plotline and the Sawyer Space Family Saga. And those 2 plot lines are what keep this entire timeline going. So with the first trilogy, we set up the kind of inner workings of the Kassan Arcanate and how it is for someone to kind of slip into that culture and live their life in it. And this is going to be just a brief overview of each trilogy. The second trilogy, the Explorer trilogy, will be the one that actually focuses on Frank Sawyer and his team of explorers. And this series is mostly episodic, so most things don't lead to the next thing, and they're pretty self-contained. So I think that'll be something that is pretty exciting moving forward. And I think a lot of people will get a kick out of how this is going to be conducted, because I don't think anybody's covered the same ideas anywhere else in the genre. I don't know why, but I guess I have my suspicions. But anyway, that's the Explorer trilogy. The third trilogy will bring the threads from the Cross Chronicles and the Sawyer trilogy together, or the Explorer trilogy together, and we end up with the Contact Chronicles. And this will be the story of the contact between both Earth and Cross, and how that kind of alters everything and kind of leads to culture clashes within both societies. So I think that would be an interesting concept to explore within the framework of this series, this ongoing series. So the fourth trilogy is going to focus on a civil war within the Kassan Arcanate, and this event ultimately leads to the Kassan Arcanate folding into a democratic, liberal democracy. So I think that will be an interesting set of installments from the series. The next thing we'll do is a short story collection where I'm planning to do decade by decade one single short story that kind of gives you an entire glimpse into this alternate timeline, like I'd given you not too long ago with the rundown between the 1910s and the 2010s, rather than the 2020s. So it'll be something like that, but in book form. There will be a fifth trilogy, and this fifth trilogy, I don't know if the fifth and the sixth one could be flipped, but the fifth one is an anthology, which would focus on a novel that I had previously wanted to produce, but instead we didn't get around to it. So it'll probably be produced as a part of this kind of anthology trilogy. So that one I think will be interesting to explore when the time comes as well. So those will be definitely even more episodic because the individual installments won't even reference the other one, because the other ones don't probably even recognize that the others exist, but that's besides the point. The sixth trilogy will be kind of a continuation of the first set of stories, but this time it'll be with Commander Alana Olson, and I think that'll be an exciting time, even though it too will be episodic, but it'll be coming out of all these years of a galactic civilization that had been exterminated and, extinct for decades, if not centuries, if not millennium. And yeah. So we were just kind of thrust in this situation where, even though intelligent life is pretty rare, when we do run into it, it comes in various forms and various weird shapes and ideals. So that one will be episodic, but it'll probably link into the larger framework of the story. The seventh trilogy, seventh, eighth, and ninth trilogy will be focusing on different aspects of the life of Frank's son, Michael. And the seventh trilogy will be basically introducing the characters, or rather, introducing the reader to the characters of his son. So the seventh trilogy will be while they explore a ring world that the ancient civilization left behind. And the eighth trilogy will be involved with a galactic war that I'd never have a chance to write, but now I can. And then the ninth trilogy will be the final trilogy in the long-running saga of 28 books, where we will close everything out in the post-war era, as Michael tries to carry on in the footsteps of his father as a diplomat, trying to balance between the demands of Earth and the demands of the planet Cross. And Michael is not the child of the daughter of the Archon Prime, but instead somebody else. So the ninth trilogy will close out the franchise, and maybe not be the end of it all, but it'll be the ending for a while. And I think it would still be quite the journey, regardless of anything else. And I do recommend that when the time comes, people stick with it. I think it'll be quite the treat for everyone to explore this new alternate world that I've created and I've been sitting on for the last 23 years. I've been considering kind of starting videos where I would release Monday videos for stuff strictly related to the world building aspect of a different fictional realm, or just exploring the world building in my own stories and kind of just going from there. I mean, I don't think we'll get the same kind of views that other channels get, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just to have fun and have a good story to tell. So mostly the series will carry on this narrative through line of like blue collar space adventurers, and I like that concept so much that I'm going to basically possibly rename the entire thing something more to the effect of like the Sawyer Space Saga or something. But I do kind of like the From the Earth to the Stars just a tad better. So this is the ultimate question. So why this story? For me, this story is a labor of love. I do it because I want to see something like this. I live by an old motto that if I can't find the book on a shelf, I'll have to write it. This is getting told. The story is getting told whether or not I make a penny or $1,000,000. Someone once told me, there's a story in you dying to come out. This is one of them. I've just always wanted to tell this story. It would be not only a labor of love, but it would be unconscionable not to go through with any of it, especially when you've been sitting on it for 23 years in different forms. But anyway, that will be my reasoning behind why I want to keep doing it. Eventually, my plan is to publish a couple of books before I dive into whatever future plans that they give me. But I don't know. I'm looking forward to exploring the world. And we'll see where most of this will end up. But I hope you join us on the journey. The first book will be Cross, and that'll be in 2025. The next book would be two different opportunities, I guess. But yeah, we'll have to see. So I look forward to continuing on and adding more stuff to the lore of the series and adding them to the channel on Mondays in the future. So after that, where else can you find my work? So it's not added yet, but I'll be adding my social medias to this specific video. But I will also be directing you to the top of the YouTube channel bio, where you can see like 11 or 12 different things that you guys can look at to keep yourselves in the mindset of my work and support me in my other projects that I do, and keep things from being stagnant, and do our best to keep things interesting regardless. So as you can see in the ticker below, though, you can follow me at Phill1 on Twitter, and you can go to my link tree to find out all the different memberships I have. And then, you can keep yourself here. You can do the thing where you don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to definitely do my best to keep us on a tight schedule. Videos every Monday, shorts every Wednesday, and live streams every Friday. And today will be no exception. So if you're watching right now or in the future, you know that you know what we're capable of here. So anyway, I think that about closes us out for our brief, almost hour and a half long deep dive into my series, the series From the Earth to the Stars. So I look forward to seeing you guys look into it, and I look forward to commenting about it in the coming days, weeks, and months. And if not, then I'm pretty sure I'll hear about it some way, somehow. We decided to use the clip art from the thumbnail from the episode From the Earth to the Stars Part 2. This was an AI generated video because I was curious to see if AI could generate something better than a human, and obviously I felt that it could not, so there's that to consider as well. But anyway, we've explored a little bit of the story, and over the next coming months and years ahead, we'll be diving further into it. I would like to keep the channel focused on science fiction, fantasy, and horror. By the end of the year, there might be a rebrand of the whole thing, but I would recommend that you pay close attention to philipleavenworth.com, where you can find blog entries that'll keep you interested and tide it over until we return in January of 2025. So we'll keep running through until December 13th or 20th, and then you will all hopefully come back and check out what we have cooking for the next few times. So yeah, I think that's about all for right now. But I just want you to know that we're all thinking of you guys, and I hope that you have definitely, if you're already a member, liked or shared or commented. And I also hope that if you're just joining us, that you like, comment, and subscribe as well, because we're going to be here for the long haul, and I want all of you guys to join in on the fun. So yeah, I'm very excited for the future. But remember, don't panic. Make sure you bring your towel everywhere. And in case anybody hasn't told you today, so long, and thanks for all the fish.